Thank you for joining us today. My name is Neelam, and I am the Engagement Evaluation Officer here at the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation. Just a few housekeeping items. By registering for this information session, participants acknowledge that their photographs and/or videos may be taken by our staff. Participants grant the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation permission to use those photographs and/or video, including websites and print publications, without compensation or reward. Also, at the conclusion of the meeting, there'll be a short feedback request. We'd be very appreciative if you would share your thoughts so that way we can provide quality content for you. All right, now that that's out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Sam Westcott. Sam has over 30 years of experience overseeing sponsored projects, grants, contracts, and clinical trials within public and private institutions. She's a distinguished educator for the National Council of University Research Administrators and has taught both grant managers and PIs through her extensive experience in interpreting institutional and sponsor policies throughout the proposal to grant closeout process. Sam is going to walk us through some basics that'll help you with the budgeting process and equip you to best work with your grant manager and sponsored research office when pursuing funding. Welcome, Sam. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Neelam. Thank you for this opportunity. I know our time is short and everybody's time is valuable. We'll have some time for questions at the end, and I'm happy to stay for discussion, and I can always be reached afterwards. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at my institution. I am currently at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. My family did a little shift after COVID and decided that a new change in a new location to be closer to family was really good, so I'd left Southern California for here. Most of my career has been in collaboration with faculty, and I'm most of it supporting their research portfolios. So I would be comfortable with any questions that you have in that area as well. This is going to be a brief walkthrough, but you will hopefully find some useful takeaways, and you are welcome to use the slides as they were developed particularly for this session. Nothing in here is, of course, trademarked. You can find this information all sorts of places. So I'm going to start to talk about first, we're going to talk about why budgets matter. Budgets are part of the scientific planning tool. They're used by reviewers to be able to assess whether or not your proposal is well thought out and managed, and it's also used by the people who help you with your financial stewardship. So it's really important to take into consideration both the science and the resources as you're putting things together. It's not just a requirement of administration. It is a critical component of the grant application, and it'll demonstrate how you will successfully, execute the proposed research. We're going to start with some essential questions. The basic questions that you learned way back in your early academic years of who, what, when, where, why, and how still come into play here. So if you keep that in the back of your mind and you think about who's going to be doing the work, what's it going to take? What do I need for supplies and services? Where is it going to happen? Who and how are the collaborators going to work together? Are things reasonable? Does the budget align with the proposed scope? And can the project realistically be completed with the requested resources? So those essentials that you learned at grade school are going to apply all the way here at this point in time in your career as you consider how to build the proposal and the related budget. I'd like you throughout this session to think about a research project that you're developing, planning, that you're hoping to submit for funding. And as we discuss each budget component, I want you to consider how that concept would apply to your project. By the end of the session, the goal is for you to envision the major elements of a complete and defensible proposal budget. So the major components of a proposal budget, and these are the ones we're going to talk about today. We're not going to get into a lot of the subcategories or things that require a little bit more detail. But we're going to take that who, what, when set of questions, and we're going to show you how it will help you build the related budget into the major components. So the major components of a budget are personnel and the related fringe benefits, equipment, supplies, travel. We're going to touch on consultants and subawards, and then we're going to dabble into other direct costs, and I am going to touch on indirect costs. I do want to say, and I'll probably revisit later, that indirect costs require a caveat right now. If you've been paying at all any attention to what's been going on with changes in the federal government since the Trump administration, there has been a lot of attempts to reduce and eliminate indirect cost recovery. And indirect cost recovery is absolutely essential for the organizations supporting the research. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm happy to talk about that offline and separately as well if you need it. I'm going to start with personnel. In almost every proposal and every award, personnel is the largest budget category. It takes people to do the work. Nothing is done without the efforts, the skills, the knowledge, the ability, the talent, and the experience to perform the work. And if we think about a research proposal, especially going after the pursuit of the scientific questions that you've been studying throughout, maybe, from the time you were young because you were inspired to understand how something works, or maybe as you got into studying for your undergraduate degree and you realized that something spoke to you and you wanted to pursue something, or as you move into your graduate studies, there's always these questions that we're trying to pursue. And that's really at the heart of what a research proposal does. And in order to do that, you need the people who have similar or consistent skills, knowledge, ability, and experience. Because this can't be done to look for the new with something that already exists. So you're going to have to bring people in. They're going to have to do the work. And the effort of that work must align with the scope of work of the proposal. So the common categories of roles of people in the personnel on a sponsored project are the PI, the principal investigator, and the co-PI or co-I. Commonly a postdoc, graduate student, research staff, and technical staff. Now, what you don't see here is you don't see administrative staff. Administrative staff's funding is generally covered as an indirect cost because it would apply to everyone and it's hard to align directly to a project. Doesn't mean that it can't be, but that would be kind of sitting outside in the exceptions where the work would specifically have to demand more and it would have to be fully justified. So when you're estimating the cost of a person, as you're starting to think about this, it's their salary times the percent of effort plus the fringe. To get a little bit more complicated, it's the salary times the effort plus the fringe plus the tuition if you're dealing with grad students. And grad students are treated differently at almost any institution. So when you learn it in one place, if you go somewhere else, expect to relearn it or learn it differently. And then we do have some sponsors, such as anybody under the Department of Health and Human Services, the public health system, public health services, they are capped on the salary. So there is generally a salary cap. So we have to make sure that that salary is always equal to or less than the salary cap times the effort plus the fringe. The thing to take away is the more complicated the calculation, the more time and care it will demand. So as you think about that project and who's going to work on it, if you're looking for you need a postdoc to do something, but maybe you don't have that postdoc, you got to think about what that's going to take to be able to figure out how much does a postdoc commonly cost? How do you make sure you budget that? And how do you accommodate for having to be able to maybe recruit? Because maybe you need to also talk about getting some advertising costs added in there because the position is only going to exist if the proposal gets awarded. So think about that as you start to put things together. So your who can get very, very complicated. Now we're going to talk about equipment. The institutional definition of the equipment is what makes it equipment versus supplies. Now there are standing definitions that everybody understands. It has to be tangible, non-consumable, and used for the research. It has to have a useful lifespan. Some institutions require that useful lifespan be more than 2 years. Some require it more than 1 year. A lot of times the useful lifespan is determined in a way that allows it to remove anything that's technology, like a computer, away from the equipment, because really generally computers are not considered capitalized equipment because the depreciation is so fast because the technology turns over. And that's where the useful life kind of comes in. And then it has to meet your institutional threshold. Some institutions have a threshold of 1,000, some have an institutional threshold of 5, some have an institutional threshold of 10. So this can sound really convoluted, but I want to get to the heart of why this exists. The whole point of the threshold and the lifespan is because what this does is it moves the cost from being subject to indirect cost and or being exempted from indirect costs. Because when equipment has the right lifespan and the right institutional threshold, it is then exempted from indirect costs and becomes part of the assets of your institution. Many people, when they start out in a lab, they're given maybe some startup funds, but they're expected to ask for pieces of equipment in their proposals to be able to do the research. And then that piece of equipment becomes an asset of the lab and of the institution. And it becomes part of the depreciation factor that's part of the indirect cost calculation. I'm not going to go into the ugly details on that. Excuse me, but you need to understand that's how the institution is approaching this particular cost category. It also sees these assets as something that's incredibly beneficial to the institution. Because let's say you get a major piece of equipment, something that is $100,000 or more, and can be used well beyond the life of the project. And so over the life of the project, it's only used for that particular research. But when the project ends, in most cases, the title of such a piece of equipment vests with the institution, and then it becomes what gets listed on your facilities and other resources. It gets shared within the organization, or it can expand the research projects done in the future because you already have this existing piece of equipment. That's why equipment is so important. And that's why it's really important to know if you don't have the actual equipment that you need to do the research, put that into your proposal. It is completely reasonable to ask for it. It's reasonable also to ask for an allocation of it. And when we get into an allocation, I'll just touch on it slightly because we're not going to spend much time there. But it's where, let's say you have that $100,000 piece of equipment and you're going to use it half the time on this particular project. You're only going to ask for half of the cost of that equipment on this project, and you're going to have to find the funding for the rest of the piece of equipment somewhere else. But that's where perhaps you can dip into startup funds. Perhaps your institution will provide you with some funding, or your department, or you can split the cost with other research projects that would benefit from it. You just have to always make sure that you understand what the cost is, how it benefits the project, and make sure that that allocation is appropriate for the work that's being done. So some of the examples that you can think about for equipment would include specialized laboratory instruments, microscopes, imaging systems, high performance computing equipment. You can use computing equipment that can be part of the capitalization and can go into depreciation. You can have server farms do that because they're certainly going to last more than the useful life of 1 or 2 years. And they're usually something that you quite often have to have if you run large data sets out of your proposals. Or research specific field equipment. You always make sure that you have to explain why the equipment is essential to achieve the project's aims. It is very smart for you to include current pricing and supporting documentation when required, which means get yourself vendor quotes. Get more than one, make sure that you have them documented so that you can back up what you're asking for in terms of numbers. Don't ever try to estimate without going with reality, and think about shipping, think about installation costs. I mean, if you're bringing in such a large piece of equipment that you have to increase the size of the doors of the lab, that can be built into the cost of the equipment. So you have to think about things ahead of time. Make sure that the equipment does not show up in the supply costs, which means all of the related costs. If the equipment requires computers to run the equipment, that's part of the equipment cost, not a supply cost. So you really need to understand all of the pieces and the parts of what makes the equipment. Consider sharing things. Determine whether or not the piece of equipment might be strong enough to set up like a core facility or to be part of a core facility you already have. Because then it might be a portion of an allocation that would go on the project for whatever portion of that allocation of the work of the equipment that will be used on the project. But then the rest of it could go to core facilities and be used within your institution. Make sure that you follow all the considerations for the proposal on the grant that you're seeking. There are very specific sponsors, specific definitions and policies from the NIH, from the NSF, from Department of Energy. Equipment is generally excluded from indirect costs based on how your model is set up. You may be required to get prior approval for equipment purchases. And quite often, you almost always have to get prior approval if there's going to be a change in scope of work. So if you hadn't listed a piece of equipment, but you realize that a piece of equipment would be useful and you're going to ask for it after the award has been made, you're quite often going to have to go back and ask for prior approval before you purchase it. On the other hand, if for some reason you acquire a piece of equipment that you had asked for before the award is made, you can go get prior approval to rebudget the funds you'd requested into perhaps the funds of the personnel who are going to conduct the experiments on a piece of equipment you managed to that you received from another source. When you justify equipment, it's really important that you list out what it is. Like, for example, saying what type of microscope it is and the cost, why it's requested, and where it supports, like for AIM 2. Talk about the comparable equipment is not available within your current resources, either within the department or within the institution, and that the instrument will be used for however the part of the time that the instrument's going to be used throughout the project. Try to avoid requesting equipment without a scientific justification. Try to avoid budgeting general purpose office equipment unless it is specifically allowed, unless you absolutely, it's part of the project. Avoid using outdated pricing estimates, especially given how inflation is working right now. And don't forget to include following your institution and their equipment policies and sponsor restrictions, because each institution has rules around what they will allow or what they will accommodate and how they will handle equipment. And then finally, budget only equipment that's essential, well justified, appropriately priced, and compliant with everything. So supplies. Supplies are those consumable items that you use to conduct research. They're routine project expenses. They support the research day to day. Underestimating consumable needs for supplies is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people make. They will round out to a number. They'll have, like, they're aiming for a budget of $200,000. They've got $1,000 left over. They throw it into supplies. Very rarely does anything come in exactly in the rounded out number. It's really important for you to request supplies that are related to the project activities and to make sure that you follow everything that's needed. For those of you who are new at this, if you're not sure how to do this, use historical spending data from like a mentor's lab or similar projects to be able to find out what everybody needs and what your needs are going to be. And make sure that you consult with your institutional purchasing staff for any kind of pricing guidance if you need it. They can help you find catalog prices. Because sometimes the catalog price in a hard catalog that's sitting on a shelf is very different than what your institution gets in their online embedded catalog in their purchasing system, because they have a deal with vendors that gets them 20% off the top. So you need to understand how that works. Make sure that the strong supply budget is realistic, well documented, directly tied to the science, and supported with strong cost calculations. So make sure, again, on the budgeting, you align the costs with the project aims, estimate the quantities realistically, use current pricing, and make sure that you break down major categories. Don't just throw in there glassware and a price. Talk about what you mean by glassware and what's included in that, and make sure you consider inflation. Pardon me. So we're going to talk about travel, but travel is really just the costs that are associated with the project-related travel. It might be for meeting with collaborators. It might be for disseminating findings. It might be for training. It can be for conferences. It can be for field work, collaborator meetings, required sponsor meetings. And this is one to keep an eye out for, because it's really easy to miss when the sponsor wants you to come in for a meeting and you forget to put it in the budget, and then you've got to go out, you've got to figure out how to rebudget to be able to fit that funding right in. And then any specialized training. So when you develop the budget, you need to think about the sponsor regulations and your institutional travel policies. And this changes from school to school, from place to place, from institution to institution. It will matter if you're at a state school like I'm at in the universities of Wisconsin versus a private institution. It's going to matter whether or not you're doing domestic or foreign travel. So it's really important for you to be able to take care and to well justify what you're doing. I also recommend that you include at least one conference to disseminate findings because that's part of the project scope and it will also help you build your professional network and it's kind of expected. Now, there is talk right now about trying to eliminate travel, eliminate publications, eliminate all of these things that have been paid for and funded on federal grants. Take a breath, keep an eye on the news, listen to your experts, and understand that right now nothing has changed. So you keep moving forward, and it's absolutely reasonable for you to ask for attending a conference to disseminate findings and meeting with collaborators. On the back of the envelope, a really easy estimate is for travel is to think about airfare, which I do highly recommend you price out, accommodation and the number of nights, meals and incidentals and the number of days, ground transportation, and registration. That'll give you the back of the envelope numbers so you can figure out how much things are going to cost. But it's very important you pay attention because a lot of times this is another area where people want to round out and just shove the money in travel. And you can go very few places on $1,200, but that might be what's left over in the budget as you're trying to get to a particular number. Things that you also need to think about is when you're working with travel for the first time. There are times when you don't know what rates to use. It's highly advised that you use the federal per diem rates. You can get this from the General Services Administration website or institutional guidance when you're not sure what to do for lodging and for meals, especially if you know that a conference is probably going to be in San Antonio in 2 years, but they haven't booked the hotel yet. That's a really good source of information, and it will probably get you pretty close so you don't end up running over in costs when the award is made. Also make sure that you work with your grants office to help with travel estimates and make sure that they comply with sponsor requirements. Just know that a strong travel budget is realistic, it's well justified, and it directly links to project goals, disseminating results, and advancing investigator development. All of those are goals and aims of a proposal. So, there's a lot of information on one slide here, but I want to talk about this. Consultants and subawards are, of course, third parties to a proposal and to an award. On the left-hand side is the definition of a consultant, on the right-hand side is a subaward. These are two very different animals, and they're treated very differently. So a consultant is an individual or an organization that provides specialized expertise. This is expertise that is not available on your project team. Consultants are not employees of your institution. They can never be employees of your institution. You cannot hire a faculty member from another department as a consultant on your grant. That's a conflict of interest, and you can have them on your grant, named as personnel, but they cannot be hired as an outside consultant, even if they do outside consulting, because that's a conflict of interest. The consultants are not responsible for conducting a substantive portion of the research. They're generally biostatisticians, subject matter experts, scientific advisors, evaluators, specialized technical experts. The way to think about a consultant is somebody you would probably not list as a co-author on any paper published on the results of this project. These are people that do this professionally, and this is what they do outside of standard research work. They are sometimes professors at other institutions, and they'll have to be very careful in checking with those institutions on whether or not they can be a consultant on a grant. But this is not somebody that you're bringing in as a party on the research plan. A subaward is the formal agreement where another institution is going to do a substantive portion of the project scope of work. That subrecipient is responsible for project performance, compliance, reporting, everything that you are responsible for as a PI there. It is for collaborating universities that are conducting some of the experiments, maybe medical centers that are recruiting participants for you. It could be for a research institute that is performing specialized analyses. Think about whether or not that party would be part of the authorship of a paper. That's quite often the easiest way for a scientist to sometimes understand between the two. And if you're confused, this is where you need to bring in someone from your organization that can help you understand where you're at and what needs to be done and how your institution handles things. Now, the budget building on this is a little easier on the consultant's role because it's generally how much their hourly rate is times how many hours, and then if you need to have them do any on-site travel, if they need to come and visit with you, or if if you need to go visit them, it would go into your travel budget. It's pretty straightforward, but you also need to understand a consultant is a direct cost and it is subject to indirect costs. There are times when an investigator will try to be clever and put a consultant into a subaward. Subawards are not subject to indirect costs after the first 25,000 or 50,000, depending on your institutional threshold. And the reason a subaward is not is because it really is a direct pass-through. It's like taking a chunk of the grant and handing it off to someone else. And all you have to do is make sure that they're doing their job. Whereas a consultant, you're hiring somebody to come in and do work at your direction. Because on a subaward, you're handing off a portion of the work, we don't get to collect indirect costs on the portion of the work that they're doing. They get to collect indirect costs on the portion of the work that they are doing. So we want to make sure that that's very, very clear. And there are very many clever young investigators who think, well, if I make my consultant into a subawardee, I'll have more money to the bottom line because they won't have indirect costs on that. A consultant is a consultant, a subawardee is a subawardee, and that the effort and the responsibilities have to be aligned correctly, and it will only become a problem for you if you try to skirt the information. A subaward also, they create the budget. They submit the budget to you. It gets embedded into our budget, and the subrecipient commitment documents have to be provided generally at the proposal stage. So it's really important to understand those two differences. So let's talk about other direct costs. So other direct costs kind of get into that miscellaneous. They're project expenses beyond the personnel supplies, the things that we've talked about that clearly link to the research plan. And one of the things that you need to understand is that they have to be necessary. And they just probably don't fall into a category that's on the document. So for example, participant incentives, publication and manuscript fees. Sometimes that's not a line that's on the budget. Core facility or service center charges, data collection, software licenses, data storage, cloud computing, research subjects, shipping and specimen transport, recruitment and advertising, and sometimes tuition. Now, institutions define this, agencies define this. So it may not always be clear and it may not be done consistently from proposal to proposal or award to award. So it's really important that you bring in people who can help you with the budget early on if you have a lot of things that land in the other direct costs. The other thing to keep in mind with other direct costs is that as you're building your budget, you often have a number of things that hit in this category, and it's only one line on your proposal budget. So make sure that it's really well justified so that it shows how it's reasonable and how it goes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to flip past those slides. Hit the wrong button. So it's really important how we show how all of this works, and it may be breaking it down into, we have participant incentives and core service charges and data collection, and break those down line by line by line by line. I talked a little bit about indirect costs. And what the indirect costs do is they help the institutions maintain the research environment. They support the services that enable the research, but cannot be directly charged to the project because we can't define it. Easiest way to talk about it is the air conditioning. You cannot determine how much of the air conditioning of a lab benefits project A versus project B versus project C. So it's when we're putting this together, you need to understand how your institution handles indirect costs. And every institution has a different negotiated rate if they have a negotiated rate, or they have a different standard default rate. And it's really important to understand how your institution works from the get-go. Also understand that it's very specific to sponsors. Some foundations and private sponsors will cap or prohibit indirect cost recovery. Some institutions will not allow for a reduced or waived indirect cost rate. So you really need to know very early on how this impacts your budget. And I'm going to tell you this, it's going to, in your career, you're going to hear it referred to as the taxes, as overhead, as F&A, as indirect. Here's what the costs are. It's capturing some kind of remuneration or reimbursement for the things that the institution is providing and paying for that they cannot directly charge to that grant. And you know, when you're doing research, that there are things that are paid for by the institution that the institution deserves and needs to be recovered from. I'm going to do a little blunt tangent here. Research is a loss leader. We are not breaking even on research. Research, every institution that engages in research loses money by performing research. But the value of research is so good and is so high and is so strong. Everyone wants to do it and everyone wants to grow it. It's really important that we get there and we keep moving forward, but we do need to recover everything we possibly can because there are so many unfunded mandates and requirements around research that if we don't recover anything in indirect costs, it can make a big difference. Now, on a side note, if we are being funded off of philanthropic funds, either an endowment or a foundation, they are doing the work of raising money from private donors or within an endowment that the institution does not have to do. So many times an institution will accept a lower or waived indirect cost rate for those funds because what they're doing in doing that fundraising and putting those funds towards our mission because it supports their mission, that's usually why an institution will accept it. But I will tell you, I've worked at institutions that will not accept a waived or a reduced indirect cost rate, or they have very specific rules around it. And I've been at institutions that require the PI to cover some of that unrecovered indirect costs. It's very, very challenging. So you really want to learn early on what the expectations are. So it's really important that you have absolutely accurate application of the indirect cost on your proposal budget. You probably have experts at your institutions that will help you do this. They generally do not leave this to the PI. So here's the process. When you're going to start the budget development process, the first thing you're going to start with is that funding opportunity announcement. What am I looking at? Where am I finding that my research idea can find some funding out there that I can write a proposal to and potentially receive? Always keep in mind that once you have determined what funding opportunity announcement or FOA you're going to follow, the number one rule is to make sure that the work that you're doing fulfills and moves forward the mission of the sponsor. Whether that sponsor is the federal government, whether that sponsor is a philanthropic organization, whether that sponsor is a mom and pop looking for something, you got to remember that what you need to demonstrate is how the work that you're doing in the scope of work helps them fulfill their mission. Once you've defined that scope of work, then you estimate the personnel because that's going to be your biggest cost. Then you build your costs. You calculate your indirect costs and you write the justification. And while this seems like it's a simple little diagram, that's really the point of it, is that you start with some kind of goal in mind, you get through it all, and you justify how that goal is going to work. Here's the thing. If the budget is too much money, you get to that budget estimate and it's way more than you wanted to, than you know you can ask for, you have to reduce the scope of work. It has to be adjusted accordingly. If it's too low, you don't have to. but I would recommend you go back and check your numbers. I would recommend you go back and check your numbers more than once or twice as it is. So we're going to talk a little bit about writing effective budget justifications. And this is the part that's kind of the ringer because this is where it can make a difference. The budget looks like the budget looks like the budget. Everything goes on their form. You can't really make your budget stand out or be strong against your proposal unless somebody really can see how the costs tie together. And this is where the effective budget justifications come in. It is the written explanation that describes how each cost is necessary to complete the project. It's the need plus the purpose equals the cost. It accompanies the budget and the rationale should line up line by line. You should be able to sit with the budget and the budget justification next to each other and see how they all line up. And it needs to demonstrate that the costs are reasonable, allowable, and directly related to the aims. I'm going to talk a little bit about reasonable and allowable because those are the terms in which the government assesses whether or not the costs are worthwhile, or when they audit, whether or not those costs should be considered as unallowable. So you need to think about what's reasonable and what's allowable. And by allowable means does it make sense? For example, like you cannot buy alcohol with NSF funds. They won't let you go out drinking on their money. So if you're going to have travel funds and it's going to have meals and per diems on it, make sure that the alcohol is excluded from it. However, if you were doing an alcohol related study, you could buy alcohol for that related study. So let's say perhaps we're checking on how rats respond to alcohol in certain conditions. But you got to be reasonable and not go out and buy the rats Grey Goose vodka. You would probably use alcohol that you would get from a laboratory supply store. So you need to think about allowability and reasonableness because that's how people are going to look at it at this stage. So make sure that you think about that as you put together your justification. The budget shows the numbers. The budget justification explains the science behind the numbers. A strong justification is on the left. A weak justification is on the right. Vague statements are so easy to write. It's so easy to just say, these are the supplies needed for the project. And I promise you, everybody waits till the last minute to do the justification because it's not as important as the scope of work. And people are going to always want to put the information in at the scope of work because it's the most critical. You cannot put vague statements in there. It's just too easy for somebody to go through and not say that it really fully explains why the expense is needed. It's very, very important that you do things so that it's consistent all the way through. But here's the thing. Once you've done one well, keep those phrasing, keep the language, keep sample language around, repurpose it over and over and over again. You don't have to write it from scratch every single time. It will get better and you will get better at it over time. I'm going to touch a little bit on the difference between federal and private sponsors when it comes to budgeting differences. Federal sponsors want the detail, it's subject to federal compliance, and it needs to make sure that it is adherent to the uniform guidance. And if you're not sure what the uniform guidance is, it's that 2 CFR 200, the Code of Federal Regulations section that we are all bound to. It's also the one that has gone through a proposed set of changes that pretty much lit up the entire research community with over, I think, about 500,000 responses that were almost all negative about the changes. So it's under a lot of scrutiny right now. But that's what we have to align it with when we're dealing with federal sponsors. Private sponsors generally want you to do your budget requirements based on what they want. They may use a very simple budget template. They may also just ask you for an Excel budget. They might limit some categories. For example, at least at one point in time, and I don't know if this is still true, the Michael J. Fox Foundation did not allow animal studies on mice, because Michael J. Fox, as an actor, had starred as Stuart Little, and they felt that there was some conflict in there. Just an odd thing, but you just need to understand it. They may also cap or prohibit indirect costs, so you need to know before. I would hate for you to put together an entire proposal and then send it through to your organization to be reviewed and submitted and find out that they won't allow it to go through because it doesn't have indirect costs. It's really important that you need to do this. Private sponsors need to see that demonstration of value. They need to see how their mission is moved forward. Private sponsors don't always have reviewers who are scientists, whereas your federal sponsors, you're going to have scientists who have PhDs and similar training and education to you sitting on that side looking at things. Private sponsors are not necessarily, so you're going to have to spell that out. And they definitely want to see a strong connection between the request and the impact. So questions to think about beforehand is to ask the questions of what they want. Now on the federal side, what are they going to want for a budget? The NIH has both a modular and a detailed budget requirement, so you need to learn about that if you're going for things. Are there limits on travel, equipment, personnel costs? If you assume that all sponsors follow federal rules, you will find yourself in a lot of trouble with a lot of extra work. And if you assume that all federal sponsors are the same, it will be challenging for you. And you never assume that all private sponsors are the same. So how do you build a budget from the specific aims? You need to start with the science. So every budget item must tie back to a project aim. So review each aims, think about those who, what, when, where, why, and then list the required resources, estimate and build your costs, and then justify it. You can do this in whichever way that you work. Maybe it's going to be like having an Excel spreadsheet open on a screen as you're doing your writing, so you can go over and say like, oh, I need to think about this. I need to think about this. I need to think about this, so that you hit every cost. But make sure that it ties back, because a well justified budget that clearly outlines from the specific aims how it links to the budget it is so helpful for reviewers. So moving from the aims to the budget categories. So if you look at things like the specific aim activity recruit participants, you're going to need personnel to do that. You're going to need some kind of incentives, because participants almost always get some kind of incentive, and you're probably going to need advertising costs. If you need to conduct lab analyses, you're going to need supplies. Maybe you're doing core facility that's doing it. You might need equipment. If you're disseminating findings, you're going to probably need travel, because you're going to have to go to the conferences to disseminate the findings, or you're going to need publication costs. It's very important that you tie the two together. If you build the budget before defining the project activities, which is such a bad habit for investigators to get into because they want to get it out of the way, you very easily can miss costs that are not linked to that. And under budgeting key activities can also set off alarms when it's being reviewed, but it will certainly set off alarms for you when you end up with costs that you can't cover because you didn't ask for it in your budget. There will also often be a mismatch then between the research plan and the budget justification. Think of the budget as the financial roadmap for the specific aims, and if reviewers can clearly connect every budget item to the work required to achieve the aims, then it will be both defensible and compelling. So you remember the professor who was a stickler for grammar, even when not an English professor? I promise you that person is on a review committee. And you remember the professor that needed clear, concise explanations on everything? They're on the review committees. You know your peers. Write your budget and your justification so that it's reasonable, transparent, and clearly aligned with the science. Reviewers rarely expect a cheap budget. We're not looking for things that are on sale. So here's a checklist that I did for you in 4 parts. So you can keep this, you can have, I sent the slides to Neelam and she can share them with you. You've got the scientific alignment, then you've got budget accuracy. So these are steps that you're going to want to take and make sure that everything's aligned, make sure that everything is accurately budgeted. Then you're going to want to make sure that it falls into all the sponsor budget limits and all of the correct rates and everything the sponsor expects. And then you're going to make sure that it's well documented and well justified, especially if you're talking about things that require quotes, things that require backup. Common final checks are looking for math errors, missing budget categories, inconsistencies between the budget and the narrative, something that's unsupported and just estimated. No last minute assumptions. Do not round out and throw $500 into travel because you have $500 left on the budget. It's just not worthwhile, because where can you go? A successful budget is scientifically aligned, mathematically accurate, compliant with the sponsor, and easy for reviewers to understand. So throughout the session, we ask that you think about a research project you're developing and thinking about this project, are there any questions that come to mind? I'm not trying to call on you either. If not, I'm going to go right into the best practices. So remember to start with the specific aims and build the budget there and ensure that every cost supports the project activity. It is highly recommended that you budget early. Take that budget on the first draft of the proposal so that you have an idea of what it's going to come. Because then you can make changes early enough, or you can ask questions early enough, or get help early enough. Document your assumptions. If you don't have access to salary data, make sure that this is documented, that this is an assumption, and make sure that the salary data gets checked. Make sure you get quotes, historical spending, and keep a record supporting your calculations because it will be very useful for you if a year later the award's going to be made and people have questions with how you got to this number. Make sure that you justify it well, that you understand the sponsor's expectations, and use whatever resources are available to you at your institution. There are people like me who've spent their entire careers doing this work. I love this work. It's weird. I'm boring as heck at cocktail parties because nobody ever wants to know why I know all this stuff. But it is really important for you to build those partnerships. And I promise you, a grant administrator who is on your side will be there and can help you through so many difficult challenges over your entire career. Let's see if a couple of takeaways for you who are younger on this is just to remember that reviewers assess whether the budget demonstrates thoughtful planning and project feasibility. When you're sending out your first couple of proposals, sometimes you get a lot of feedback that are you sure that you're capable to do this? The stronger that proposal is on both the science and the budget justification side, the harder it is for them to say you're not ready. So in closing, the successful grant budget is not about asking for the most money or the least amount of money. It's about requesting the right resources at the right level with a clear rationale that demonstrates how you can achieve the science.
Our audience is uncharacteristically quiet today, so I actually have a question for you, Sam. If you, let's say you're brand new to creating a budget, never done it before, and certainly there are, I could talk to sponsored research at my institute. But are there other resources that you would recommend? Like, are there templates out there that we could find that kind of help build a budget that would be good? Where would you recommend we start?
Yeah, there's a number of different places. Honestly, start with where you're most comfortable getting your information. I mean, it's as hard as that is to believe. It's like you found your way to success using paths that you're comfortable with. So using those paths make a lot can really help you. I will tell you that be careful with AI because it can be incorrect, especially because it's scraping data from all over the place and the differences exist everywhere. So I would almost start with what are you looking to find out? Are you looking to find out what kind of funding is available out there? Then you need to find the resources of the people who help you with that. Generally, those are considered research development team members. So you can find either they're at your institution, they might have different titles, but you can find some kind of research development resources, and they might be able to help you work with, say, Pivot. Pivot is a database that's available to a lot of institutions that a lot of institutions use that can help you find funding opportunities. If you're looking for, you've got an idea about funding opportunities, or you're really more interested in what a successful proposal looks like, there are lots of examples out there, tons and tons of examples. Now, if you're looking for how really good, strong research administration looks, there's a couple of places you can always turn to. First of all, the University of Michigan, they do great website, great development. Really, some of your strongest schools can have this, but University of Michigan, top notch. If you're looking for information on how the roles work, roles and responsibilities as a matrix across research administration, CU Boulder has one of the best matrices that can kind of show you how things work and who does what. So there's all sorts of questions. So think about how you approach things. But the other thing is I'm sorry, but hit me up on LinkedIn. I've been doing this for so long. And I love this and I know everybody. So I'm like, I'm happy to answer a question, help point you in the right direction. Nobody tells you this stuff. Nobody ever tells you this stuff. Nobody tells you that you're going to be sitting behind a desk writing and doing this kind of analysis. So think about how you approach things well and start to set up some really good habits for yourself so that you're not playing catch up at the end. Because the hardest time is when you are up against that proposal deadline. It doesn't move. It's a fixed deadline. You have got to get it in. And if you have if there's been all of this extra work created because you missed the mark somewhere along the lines in building the budget or in understanding how indirect costs work or how what signatures you need in your institution, you end up wasting all this time trying to figure out all of this administrative mishigas when you could just get that proposal out the door and look at it one more time. So use all the resources that got you where you are now. You didn't get where you are now by not being able to figure out how to work a system. You didn't get where you are now to not learn how to like write something coherently that people will read and be convinced by. All of those skills come in when you're going to do research. But there are also tons of professional research administrators like myself who are happy to help you. I had no calling to do the research, but I understand research is a calling. It's no different than the ministry. You're just asking questions of the universe or questions of the world. And I'm not a religious person, so like that's how I equate it. I'm like, it's just as valuable, and these questions are really important. But the way to be able to fund asking those questions and conducting those experiments, that's what I'm happy to do. I don't know why, but I am.
Thanks. Anybody else have a question for Sam?
I have a quick question. Thank you so much for your presentation. Would something like a lab manager go under personnel, or is that administrative? How
Love
does
that
that get
question.
kind of?
So when I worked, I spent half of my career at Caltech. So that's how Neelam and I know each other. We were collaborators at Caltech. And the first half of my career at Caltech, I spent in the biology area. And that was one of the things that I loved is that we would have lab managers who did small amounts of administrative tasks, like keep up a calendar or something. But most of what they did was, of course, order supplies and help the grad students and all that. And all of those lab managers could be applied directly to the grants because they weren't doing what administratively was provided by the institution. They were doing specific work for the function of the lab. And they were never paid 100% on a grant, but a portion of their work. I would meet with the PI and we would figure out what kind of allocation, what portion of the work should be applied to the grant. So this is an excellent question. And it's if you're in the life sciences, it's great. If you move into physics, you don't get that.
Thank you.
Unfortunately.
I think Todd was next.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really nice. What I wanted to ask was, do you have any advice on budgeting after the proposal is funded?
Yes.
In my experience, budgeting is a lot easier to do when it's on paper, and sometimes it's not
Yes.
as easy to do once it's in practice. So,
Yep.
any thoughts you had on that would be great.
Absolutely. So the uniform guidance, when it was issued in 2014, one of the things that it did is it really moved, expanded authorities to everyone. And without giving you a big long history lesson, in the past, you used to have to ask permission for any kind of little iterative change over the course of the project. And what they've essentially done is they recognize that universities and the PIs have the cognitive awareness to be able to do things well. And so there usually is flexibility. So at most institutions, while they may put your budget, let's say your budget is in exactly how it was proposed, and that's what it looks like in your financial system, and your spending doesn't necessarily align to that. It might come down to how your institution moves things around in budget categories, but for the most part, you can spend as the project builds. But here's the things that you want to look for. You want to look for anything that would look like it was changing the scope of work. Because even if it's not, so let's say you had two grad students, you were gonna have two GRAs. But your GRAs managed to get fellowships and they're off doing their own things. So you're going to recruit a postdoc. You have an opportunity. You've got the budget left over from the grad students you weren't paying for. So you want to recruit a postdoc. What you want to do is you want to say like, okay, I can do this. You meet with your institution. You say, how do I then translate this? Now, your institution may say, we should go ask for permission. You may be able to say, actually, it doesn't change the scope of work. We shouldn't have to get prior approval on this because the postdoc is going to be able to do the same kind of work that the grad assistants were going to do because the postdoc already has some of the knowledge, the skills, the ability. You get that postdoc in there. That postdoc costs less than the two. You can then usually spend the difference on, like, maybe you've got a little bit more money. You can take the postdoc on a trip with you when you hadn't planned on taking the two grad students. You have flexibility. You just have to learn what flexibility you have, and you don't have to get into all the details. This is where I really hope you do get to get with a professional research administrator at your institution and ask them to help you. There are people like me all over. Does
Thank
that
you.
help?
Great info.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Cami?
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi.
This was really, really informational. Um, just as a question, you talked about accounting for inflation in a lot of the
Yes.
different
Yes.
categories. Is there a general rule of thumb
Yes.
for like an amount?
There is generally most institutions and most sponsors will let you do a 3% rate of inflation. If they let you do 4%, take the 4%. The problem is because it's like, rate of inflation changes. So like that's where like sometimes reading the like getting into the nitty gritty on the funding opportunity announcement really helps because if you can ask for 4%, ask for 4%. Sometimes they won't let you inflate it all. You're just stuck, But here's another thing that I want to keep in mind when it comes to inflation. Let's say you're starting out as an assistant professor. You're coming along and you're like at your 5 years, you're coming up towards tenure. You're pretty sure you're going to get it. And you're going to flip from assistant to associate professor and your salary is going to take a big jump. If you know that's likely to happen and you're putting a proposal budget together, put that in your proposal budget. It's completely reasonable. If you know that you're like, there's like somebody else is about to get a promotion or like, and that you build that in, but don't build it in and think that you can use that to get that promotion. You see the difference? So the thing where people get in trouble with the federal government where you have said something you're not allowed to say or you've asked for something is it's what's called a false claim. And you've heard about false claims because that's where everybody gets hung up. It's on false claims. And a false claim is when you knowingly ask for money or to be reimbursed for a cost that you know is misrepresented. So putting in a salary that you're not sure you're going to get, but if I got it in the grant, maybe they'll give it to me. No. But if you know, the odds are very good. You've lined it up, you're up for tenure and you're likely to get a 20% raise. Please put that in. Now, I will also tell you, I've had more than enough faculty where I knew it was likely to happen. I built it in. They made me tweak it out because they didn't want to jinx it. So it's okay otherwise. But keep that in mind. Does that help? Excellent.
Go ahead, Levi.
Hi, Samantha. Thanks for
Hi.
the amazing and enthusiastic presentation. This was super insightful. I apologize if I missed it because I was a few minutes late. But I was wondering if you could comment about like so I guess for context, I'm a Beckman postdoc currently and eventually in the future, hopefully I'll be writing my own grants and awards.
Yep.
Um, and I'm curious if you could comment about PIs including, summer salary and percent
Yep.
contribution and how that plays in a role.
Yeah.
I was thinking of this question because you were just commenting about salary raise, and that got me thinking about summer salary and other hidden costs.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you just a tiny little bit of background. So, like I had mentioned earlier, that I've been at Caltech for half my career. Caltech faculty are 12-month appointments. There's no summer salary. And in 2010, there was an Office of Inspector General audit against Caltech, and they got dinged because they didn't put any effort on their NSF grants. And NSF at the time only allowed summer salary. So you can't put something that doesn't exist. So then NSF, after getting like they got pushed back, they were like, oh, we'll let you then put any like 2 months as your cap, but that's like most people most institutions didn't bat an eye because most institutions have summer salary and that's how faculty get paid in the summer and that's when they do their research. At Caltech, it mattered because all of a sudden we had to start applying salary to faculty for NSF grants. So this is going to come down to how your institution works and how your institution does things. So I'm now at a public institution, 9-month appointments, summer salary is a thing. That's like they have to teach. And if they're going to do research anytime during the school year, they have to either get like they have to get an overload, or they have to be able to get like the buyout so that somebody else teaches so that they can conduct their research, or they do it over the summer. So summer salary, you just have to make sure that you calculate correctly. And that's where it really comes down to like, how does your institution do it? The one thing I want you to keep in mind though, is because summer salary is often 100%. Very rarely are you ever going to put 100% of your effort on a grant. But if you're doing 2 months of summer salary and that's what you're going to get paid from, you will quite often say, my effort is going to be 100%. Anytime you put 100% effort on anything for any period of time, you need to be really careful. Because if you attend a committee meeting during that time that you're working, that is not 100%. So I highly recommend putting like 95 if you're going to do any other thing, and especially if you're going to write a proposal over the summer, because proposal preparation is absolutely unallowable on a grant, unless of course the grant requires it. But it's an unallowable cost. So think about how you're going to spend that summer, because that's an easy, low-hanging piece of fruit for an auditor to come in and say, well, you said you were going to work 100% over those 2 months and you took a 2-week vacation. How was that 100%? So yes, you can absolutely apply summer salary, and it really comes down to school. Your public institutions are going to probably have a little bit more with buy-in, because generally the taxpayers and the state budget pays your salary, so you're not necessarily expected to do research, and it depends on the institution. I'm at the only other R1 in the University of Wisconsin system, so it's very different when they're at comprehensives, because at a comprehensive they're not doing research as much, and they're not having, like we're the other R1. There's Madison that everybody's heard of, and we're the other R1, but we still have to consider that, because we're still a teaching college first and foremost. And since no one has their hand up, I had one more thing I wanted to say back from Todd's question. One of the things that I want you to think about is, when an award comes, seriously take a look at the spending every month. It's so easy to ignore your budget. And I don't know about any of you, but I hate looking at, like, I don't balance my checkbook every month. Does anybody balance a checkbook anymore? I mean, some of you probably do. But like, you don't want to look at, like, you pay the bills and you just keep going, right? You don't want to think about it. But if you start at the beginning looking at it every month, the problems present themselves very quickly. Because if there are no problems, you're like, oh, this looks good. And then because you'll start to see a pattern. Like, we spend $8,000 every month on this grant. 8,000, ding, 8,000, ding. You get a $15,000. You're going to ask a question. Why is this one 15,000? If you look at it every month, it's going to be a lot easier for you to find problems before they turn into really big problems, because you don't want to have to deal with the financial stuff after the award comes if it's problematic, or if you do, you want to catch it right away. And here's the other thing. Just be super nice to administrative people, even if they make you nuts. Seriously. Because we look out for our faculty, but I promise you, you treat one person badly, they tell everybody else. We warn everybody else. And then that person, like, you still get the same, you don't get mistreated, but you don't have somebody looking out for you. You don't have somebody stepping up. You don't have somebody saying, oh, I like this funding opportunity across my desk and it might be useful to you. Or I heard that the institution is doing this. We love being allies with faculty, but we won't be allies with faculty who throw us under buses.
I think Levi has a follow-up question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yep, I just had a quick follow-up. Yeah, I guess so I am pretty familiar with seeing, I guess, well, or rather not seeing summer salary in my PI's
Yes, right.
uh portfolio, because he was very transparent about his grant funding situation and the
That's great.
percent contribution, but it's still confusing to me. So 'cause there's so
Yes.
many aspects to it and facets. And so I guess my follow-up was about percent contribution
Yeah.
and
So this is
what
going to
you
come back.
assign and how that might change if you get like multiple
This comes
grants.
back to your institution. It comes back to how you've done. So we'll go
Mm,
back to use the Caltech as an example, because Caltech is an anomaly. If you think about a shopping mall and all the other universities are like different stores, Caltech is a boutique. And faculty teach what, one course a year? So faculty are running up into the tens of percentages in terms of effort because they're doing research first and foremost. And most institutions of higher education have a three-legged stool that they expect faculty to sit on. Teaching, research, and service. Teaching is a teeny tiny leg on that stool. It is a one-legged research stool. So that you have to it's great, but it doesn't represent the norm. The norm, you got to think about those all three tiers. Because if you're going to be a professor at most institution, so I also worked for the universities of California, and the universities of California, those three tiers were there. But like when I worked for the universities of California, faculty would put like a reasonable amount of effort, like what they thought they would be putting on the grant into their budget, but they never charged it because they knew their effort was paid for, their salary was paid for by tuition, and they would use or by tuition and budget, so they would use whatever the difference was for any cost overruns, and they kind of knew that, so they had like an automatic cushion built in. So what you have to do is you kind of got to get into your institution and find the culture and find the way that things are done. Here, we do things pretty much above board. We don't do a ton of research. So it's like people are usually going from like one grant to the next grant and not having a portfolio. When you have the portfolio and you have multiple levels of effort, it's completely okay. You just have to make sure that you stay on top of start date, end date. It's completely reasonable to ask a sponsor to delay a start by 6 months so you can finish up another project. It's also completely reasonable when you only have one project going on for you to ramp up the effort onto that particular project and dedicate more effort to it within that season. But you just got to stay on top of all of this. And the thing is, I'm going to give you truckloads of empathy right now. It's hard because you're trying to stay on top of everything. I mean, you hit that tenure clock coming out of the gate, and you've got to get grants, you've got to get publications, you've got to teach, you've got to do service. And let's see, you're probably in the early stages of a relationship or a marriage. You might be having kids. You're also trying to figure out how to buy your first house. And it is hard. Ask for help. You're super smart people and you're used to doing things on your own. Ask for help.
Right. We went a little long today,
Yes.
but hopefully everybody took away a little something that is helpful to them. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
Appreciate
And
it. And thanks
like I said,
everyone for
feel free to
joining
reach
us.
out to me on LinkedIn, stay in touch. I also am like connected with a lot of people, so feel free to go through my connections. If you want to meet somebody, I'm happy to make an introduction. So thank you all.
Thank
Be
you.
well. Bye.